Okay, so in this video we are going to finish off the Firedebuff mechanic, and some of these mechanics that we are adding will also be applied to the other debuffs, so it will be easier for us to create the rest of the debuffs. But the Firedebuff is the first debuff we are creating, so we have to lay down the groundwork here, right? So first of all, we have to add some things to our towers for it to actually work, right? Because every single debuff needs to have some kind of duration. So if we go to the tower script, if I can find it somewhere, let's see here, tower. And up here we have to add a debuff duration to the tower because every single tower needs debuffs. And that's why we are adding it to the superclass, which is tower. We could add a debuff duration to fire tower, to frost tower, and so on. But there's no point in adding the same value more times. So let's just do it here in the tower. So let's make a private float called debuffs duration. So this is my debuff duration, and I would like to set it from the inspector, so I'm just going to serialize this field. So besides that, I will need to be able to access this duration at some point. So I am simply going to make a property here for accessing this. Let's see where it went. Here we go, so that I can access the debuff duration, because I will need to know how much time is left on the debuff, or how much time the debuff should last, right? And I need to access that from the projectile script, for example. So that's why I make this public. Later we will also have to change this because we need to upgrade the tower so that maybe the debuff duration is longer. And I think that's why we need to leave the set in here so that we can set it at some point. But I think that's what we need to do for now for this one. We are also going to add a proc, programmed random occurrence here. Yeah, let's do it already. So let's see, we have the debuff duration. Underneath here we make a private float called proc, so that we can actually set this. So there's a chance that the debuff will be applied, right? So instead of just having the debuff applied every time it hits a target, it will have a chance to be applied. And usually they use that in a lot of games, right? For example, World of Warcraft. Well, it's not 100% chance that the debuff will be applied if it's a debuff that comes off of some other spell or something. And we're doing the same here, right? So we have a proc, and we're going to set that, for example, to 10%. So basically 1 out of 10 times it will be applied to the target. Maybe we'll put this at 100% right now when we're testing, but for now let's just add it so we can use it. So how do we use the proc? Well, if we go to the projectile script, let's see, we have something called projectile somewhere. There we go. And we have apply debuff. Well, inside apply debuff we will actually have to do a roll so that we know if we need to apply the debuff. So the thing is, you can only apply a debuff to a monster of a different type, which means a fire tower will not be able to apply a debuff to a fire monster. So we need to say if our target dot element type, see, we don't have an element type, let's go to that. So a target is a monster, and if we go to definition of monster, we should have an element type here, but it's private, so we need to access it. So let's make a property and make sure that we can only get the element type here, right? So I just made a property. You can right click and say quick actions encapsulate field, or you can just write this code here I've highlighted. It's up to you. Anyway, let's get back here. If the target dot element type isn't the same element as the projectile, so if the projectile's element type is different from the target's element type, then we say make a roll and say random.range 0 to 100, right? So we roll between 0 and 100, and based on that we will see if the debuff needs to be applied. So if our roll is less or equal to tower target, I think it's parent dot proc So we see we have a parent here, and our parent is a tower. And if I go to the tower, we have a proc, and we can't access the proc yet, so we need to make sure we can access that. So go to the proc here, we need to get and set, I think. Now we have a proc, so we can go back to our projectile and say that if our parent.proc, so if our role is less or equal to parent.proc, well, then we say target.add debuffs. So then we add the debuff, right? So let's say that our proc is 10 and we roll a 9, well, then we will add the debuff. If our proc is 50 and we roll 80, then we are not going to apply the debuff because we rolled outside the range of the proc. That's how we're going to make a random chance for it to be applied. So if we save this and jump into our Unity project here and find our prefabs here and towers and select the different towers here, see there's something called a proc, right? So right now let's just put it to 100% and 100 and 100 and 100. Besides that, we also have a debuff duration now, and we need to set them. So the storm tower is going to stun the target so it doesn't move at all. And because it's going to stun it so it doesn't move, the debuff duration is not going to be very long. So I'm just going to put it at 1 second. And we can always adjust this, right? So let's see the poison tower. Well, the poison tower needs to put a debuff on the target so it drops poison on the ground. So the debuff duration is going to be 5 seconds. The frost tower is going to slow down the target, and the debuff duration is going to be 5 seconds. And then we have our fire tower, and the debuff duration here is going to be 10. I think maybe it's a lot, but let's leave it at 5. 5 or 10. We can always adjust that to see if it's not powerful enough. We can always adjust it, right? So now the things out here are set, but if we jump back to the script, we have to do something about the fire tower, because our fire tower needs a few things for it to work, right? Because it needs to add some things to the debuff. So let's make a private float called tick time, because a debuff is on the target and it will tick every some seconds, right? And we can upgrade the tower so it ticks more often. So let's just make a tick time here. And then we need to make how much damage, right? So it can fly up float, tick damage. And this is the reason that I made specialized tower scripts, because the towers are going to have different debuffs, right? So the tick damage and the tick time needs to be accessed from outside. So let's just make these into properties with a get on them, because we only need to get them, we don't need to change it during the game, because there's going to be a function for that. So tick time and tick damage needs to be properties. Okay, so here we go. Right now we are returning a debuff with the target, right? But we need to give a tick damage to the debuff, we need to give a tick time to the debuff, we need to give a target to the debuff, and a debuff duration. So basically we'll have to go to our Firedebuff here by right clicking, go to definition, and here we have to change the constructor. So let's say we have a float called tick damage, we have a float called tick time, and we have a monster as a target, and let's just say we have a float called duration. Okay, so we have damage, time, and duration, and a monster. But we're not using these for anything right now. First of all, the fire debuff needs a tick time, because how often do we need to tick? It needs a time since tick here, so we know when it ticked last time. And we need a private float called tick damage as well. So in here we say this dot tick damage equals tick damage, and this dot tick time equals tick time. So now we have set the damage and the time, and this one will be set during the update. This one, sorry. So we have an update here. Right now, it doesn't really have the right functionality, right? Because it gives 1 fire damage to the target no matter what. Well, we're not interested in that. We want to give it its tick damage. So this will be different depending on the actual, what's it called? The actual upgrade of the tower. So this one is complaining because it takes an integer. Let's go to definition and change damage to float. There we go. And let's go back to fire tower. Where is it? Frost, storm, poison, frost. Okay, I'm blind. I'm going to go here. Not fire tower, sorry. Fire debuff. Okay. So right now it takes tick damage, right? But that's not enough. We need to do some more things. So we need to change this so that it only does tick damage every some seconds, right? So first of all, we say if our target isn't null. So if the debuff has a target, just gonna close all of this. Yes. So if the debuff has a target, then we say time since tick plus equals time dot delta time. So we need to add something, right? So every time update runs, we increase the time since last tick. So we count up first time. It's 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, or whatever, like milliseconds. Then we say, well, if our time since tick is larger or equal to time tick time. So this is how often. So the tick time is going to be how often our debuff will tick. So if this one is at 1 second, well, then it's going to tick every 1 second. And now remember why 5 seconds isn't enough here. Let's see, the fire here has 5 seconds, but if it's only going to tick every 1 second, it's only going to do 5 ticks. That's not a lot of damage, so let's set it to 10 on the fire. So if the time since last tick is larger than the tick time, so if the time that has passed is larger than the time that should pass before we tick damage again, we say time since tick equals 0, so reset the timer, and we deal damage to the monster. So if we play this right now, we should be able to simply just deal damage, right? Let's see what we have here. Yeah. So we need to give in the right parameters here. What do we have? We have a tick damage first. We have a tick time. And we have a duration, debuff duration there. There we go. So we need to make sure that fire debuff takes in the right parameters now, because we simply just changed this constructor here, and to apply this constructor we need to give in the right parameters here. So when we have done that, we can go back to Unity and hope this error disappears. So there we go. And if we select our prefabs, our towers and our fire tower, we'll see we have a tick time. Let's tick every 1 second, and let's deal 5 damage as out of the gate, right? However, there's something missing. Let's try to see. We have a debuff duration here, yeah. So let's try to play the game. You will see what's the problem here. If we can run it, there we go. Let's place 1 fire tower and go, and we apply. We hit this one. There we go. And it keeps taking and taking until it dies. Well, if we, for example, say that this one needs to deal 1 damage, for example, and let's see the monster prefab here. Yeah, let's just do with 1 damage. Let's see. Sorry, I'm just thinking out loud. That one doesn't work because it's a fire monster. Can't hit that with the debuff. There we go. Let's see. So it hits the monster, and it keeps reducing it and reducing it and reducing. Okay, so the monster can't live long enough for us to see it, but right now we're never removing the debuff. So even though the debuff would do a very, very little amount of damage, it will still stay on the monster forever until it actually dies. Let's see here. If we put the duration, for example, let's say it does 1 damage, but duration is also 1 second, right? It should only tick 1 time. It should only be allowed to tick 1 time, but as you'll see, it will actually tick more times. Of course, you spawned with monster. There we go. And it ticks, and it ticks, and it ticks, and it keeps ticking. So what I'm trying to show you here, which is very hard, is the fact that it doesn't really come off that debuff by time. And we need to add some functionality so that it does come off after a while, because we have this debuff duration here, and the debuff duration was 10, and we need this one to come off at some point after 10 seconds. So how do you do that? Well, we need to go to our what's called debuff. Where do we have it? There. And inside the debuff, we will have to make a new public virtual void called remove. And if our target is null, then we say target dot, and here we can only add debuffs. So our target needs the function for removing debuffs. And here comes the tricky part, because if I would just say target dot, let's go to our target, sorry, let's go to our monster here. If I would go in here and access this one, let's say we just make a new function called, one called add debuffs, make a public void called remove debuff, and we call debuff, and then we just simply say debuffs dot remove debuff. Let's try. So if I simply do like this, let's see what it's complaining about. Debuffs, sorry. So if I simply do like this to remove something from the debuffs list, well, then we are going to have a problem at some point, I think. But now let's just try this, and then you'll see what the error might be. So if we say target dot remove debuffs, this. So we will try to remove the debuff. When are we going to remove the debuff? Well, first of all, the debuff needs to know how long time it has been on the target, right? So we need to make a protected float called duration. We need to make a protected float called elapsed. So we need to know how long it needs to be there and how much time it has been there. Okay? And in the debuff constructor here, we need to tell it, well, we need to take in a duration, and this duration needs to be equal to duration, so that the debuff knows how long time it needs to stay on the target. Then it's going to complain out here saying that, well, we are never adding the duration to the base because this is the fire debuff, which inherits from debuff, and we need to pass on the duration from the fire debuff up to the debuff. Make a comma here and write duration. So now that we've done that, the debuff here knows what its duration is. So we can say elapsed plus equals time dot delta time. So that's how long it has been on the target. If elapsed is larger or equal to duration, then we call remove. Then we execute this one, remove debuff here. And actually, I think elapsed here is not going to be used anywhere else. Let's just make it private. There we go. No reason to make it protected right now, I think. Okay, so now we have an update on the debuff, and the fire debuff here runs its own update and figures out when to tick. It calls the base update, which calls the update on the debuff, so that it checks if it has elapsed enough time. If elapsed is larger than the duration it needs to stay on the target, remove it from the game. So if we jump into Unity, we will see that there are 3 errors, and that's because the other debuffs also needs to have the same match the constructor from the debuff now, because we actually just changed the debuff constructor to a duration, right? So basically we can just go to the others. Let's say frost debuff and write (1), for example, and we can do the same with the poison (1). This is just temporary. And frost debuff, let's see, we have fire, frost, poison, and storm. Do (1) here just to remove the error. We will fix this later, but for now let's just put 1. It doesn't really matter. Okay, so the error should now disappear, and they did. So let's see if the debuff actually drops off the target. If we go to prefabs, towers, fire tower, let's see, we have a debuff duration. Let's put it at 1 second, right? And let's run this and see what happens. Fires, and we get an exception, and that's exactly what I expected. And what is this exception? Well, it says that collection was modified when enumeration operation may not execute. So we can't run through our list at the same time as we're modifying it. And what does that mean? Well, as we can see, let's see, we have something called a monster here. Inside the monster, we have a debuff list. This list is run through down here. So let's say it has 10 debuffs on it. It runs through the list of debuffs and updates every single debuff, right? That means that handle debuffs here is actually executed in update somewhere. Wow, this script is larger than I thought, than I remember. Let's see, we have handle debuffs there, right here in update. That means on every frame, that's like 60 times a second, for example. It actually runs through the debuff list and makes sure that they update and everything. Well, if this one runs, and let's say the time runs out and a debuff needs to be removed, we try to access debuffs here and remove the debuff from the list while this for each loop runs through it. And that means that for each loop is already iterating through the list. It has a log on this list here. It has a log on it, which means that this function up here is not allowed to go in here and remove something from it, because this is already running through it. And if we're doing that, then this up here will mess it up, because we're removing something while iterating through it. And that's exactly what this invade operation exception says. It says collection was modified. Enumeration operation may not execute. So we're modifying a list while we're trying to run through it with an enumeration. So how do we fix this? Well, we need to make another list, and we need to make actually 2 lists, just to make sure that nothing ever happens. We will never run into the problem where we are trying to run through the list while adding something, because right now we're just trying to remove something here while running through it. But we might also have a problem if we try to add a debuff while running through it. So that means if he has a debuff on him, he's updating the debuff, and we add another debuff, then it might also give you that exception, because you cannot add something to a list you are running through at the same time, because that's also modifying the list while iterating through it. So removing and adding will break our code. So let's make 2 new lists. Let's go up here. Let's make a private list with debuffs and call it debuffs to remove. Let's just copy paste this, it's easier. There we go. And let's make another list called new debuffs. There we go. Okay, so debuffs to remove. Well, we need to go to the remove function here and say debuffs to remove dot add debuff. There we go. So we're adding the debuff we want to remove to the debuffs to remove list. Okay. The next thing we have to do is to handle the new debuffs, right? We have a function called add debuffs right here. Well, it needs to add it to another list. It needs to add it to the new debuffs. So instead of debuffs, we write new debuffs. Okay, so now we have these two functions, but this doesn't work right now, because right now we are adding something to a new list, and we are adding removing something from another list, right? We're adding something to debuffs to remove as well. And how do we actually use this in here? Well, we need to add some more functionality to this list. We actually need to say if new debuffs. So if a new debuffs, the count is larger than 0. So if we want to, this basically checks, well, do we have any new debuffs to add to the target? Let's say get hit by a projectile, for example. Well, if that's the case, we say debuffs dot add range new debuffs. So it actually takes everything from new debuffs and takes us from that and adds it to the debuff list. And then we make sure that we say new debuffs.clear. So why do we do that? Well, let's say we have 3 debuffs we need to add to our debuffs list. We take them from here and add them here. And if we don't clear, then the next loop, it will add them again. So we will get unlimited stacking debuffs, right? So just to make sure we only add them once, we make sure that after we have added everything from the new debuffs list to the debuffs list, we clear the new debuffs, so it doesn't happen all the time. And we have to do the same for each debuff in debuffs to remove. And here we can also make an if statement, say if debuffs, or actually we don't, because it's not going to run through this if it's empty. So we can say debuffs dot remove debuff. Okay, so lots of names that looks alike here. So for each debuff in our debuffs to remove, we remove them from the other list, right? So look at this, we run through the debuffs to remove list and remove them from the debuffs list. And then we simply say debuffs to remove dot clear down here. So we clear it every time. And then we update. And the thing is, because we're doing this before we update, we'll never run into a problem where it's trying to update while it's adding debuffs and removing them. So this setup will make sure that we try to add debuffs and remove them before we try to update them. So now there shouldn't be any problem at all for us with attacking the monster and removing the debuff right away. There's a red monster, of course. Now red monster again. Let's try with the fire tower as well. There we go. So it should just hit the target and drop off. And hit the target and drop off. So now there was no problem with us applying a debuff and removing it. So sorry if I went through some things a little fast in this video, but we had a lot of things we needed to cover, and I know it's a little complex, some of these things, but now we should have the groundwork for actually applying the rest of our debuffs, because right now our fire tower debuff should be working. Basically we can just put this back at a duration of, let's say duration 10 seconds for example on our tower, and yeah, tick damage should be, yeah, maybe 5 and stuff. You can always change this, but for now I think this is okay. So thanks for watching, and don't forget to follow and subscribe to my channel and like my Facebook page. And also, if you like my tutorials, then don't hesitate to support me by going to Patreon or by going to the page where you can actually buy my project as a standalone product. But you can learn a lot more about how you can support me by clicking the link on the screen right here. So thank you very much for watching.